Hello everyone. Today we want to discuss the first steps that you would take whenever you are dealing with a contaminated site. As we discussed in the past, soil or properties or groundwater could be polluted as a result of certain activities, for example, manufacturing, oil and gas industry, agricultural activities like adding fertilizer or manure to soil, or for example having a landfill, leachate from landfill, or any other activities that could basically pollute the soil. Whenever the soil is polluted, the property owner, or basically sometimes we may refer to the owner as a client, might come to a consultant and ask for help. By asking for help, we mean to determine if the site is actually polluted, if the pollution is more than what is restricted by the environmental guidelines, and to take potential remedial actions. So basically, the client comes for help, and consultant will try to see if anything can be done for the property. However, it's important to know that the soil remediation requires certain steps. The first important steps in soil remediation is understanding what is going on in the site, and there are two important steps that are usually required. We call them phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. What are the phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments? Environmental site assessment basically is an investigation in relation to land to determine the environmental condition of property. This means that you will figure out what is going on and what is the condition of the property right now in order to determine if any action is needed or how that action should be taken in the future. Environmental site assessment usually includes two steps. Phase 1 environmental site assessment, usually we show it as phase 1 ESA, and phase 2 environmental site assessment, or phase 2 ESA. Let's see what are the main objectives of each of these steps. We'll start with environmental site assessment, the phase 1 environmental site assessment. There are certain objectives in phase 1 environmental site assessments. The first important objective in phase 1 environmental site assessment is to determine the likelihood of any contamination, any soil or groundwater contamination in the property. Of course, this is not very easy, and in the first phase 1 environmental site assessment, we must keep in mind that we do not want to spend too much resources or time. We are trying to find as much information as possible at as low cost as possible. So it is very important to know that we are not taking samples, we are not doing rigorous analysis in the land. We're just trying to gather information about the land that will help us to understand whether or not the site is likely contaminated. The second objective of the environmental site assessment, phase 1 environmental site assessment, is to determine if phase 2 environmental site assessment is needed. As we will see in the future, phase 2 environmental site assessment usually involves taking samples, spending more time, of course more money, and basically is much bigger step compared to phase 1 site assessment. So one of the main objectives of environmental site assessment, phase 1 environmental site assessment, is to determine if phase 2 is needed or not. So sometimes when you do phase 1, you may conclude that there's no much activities that could possibly result in soil contamination, and therefore you may actually end up concluding that phase 2 is not needed, and that way you will save a lot of you'll save your client a lot of money. So it's very important that you do your phase 1 environmental site assessment very carefully before because that could actually save a lot of money. Also, on the other hand, phase 1 might actually help you to determine that actually phase 2 is needed, which is also important, very important information for your client. Phase 1 also will provide a basis for phase 2 site assessment. For example, if in your phase 1 you will figure out that there was an underground storage tank that was removed 2 years ago from the land, you already know the location, you already know the type of contamination that you would possibly look for in your phase 2 environmental site assessment, and you also will know how much damage could have happened in your property. So basically you'll provide some basis that for the next step. Keep in mind that even though it is very common that the same company or the same consultant that does the phase 1 environmental site assessment also performs phase 2 environmental site assessment, it may not be always the case. So it is very important to know that whenever you prepare the report of phase 1 environmental site assessment, you'll need to include as much information as possible in your report, so the next person who will take on the environmental site assessment phase 2 will already have that kind of information. So basically you're creating a base. The other objective of phase 1, again related to the third objective here, is to try to gather as much information as possible in phase 1 that could be in the future used for phase 2. That kind of information could be also used for next steps, which is actually designing a soil remediation plan for your property if the contamination exists. So it's very important to include as much information as possible. For example, if there is any underground tank, if there is any barrier, any risk that could exist in the area, any contamination to the groundwater, any new development in the area. For bigger areas, probably the future use, for example, of the area. If there's a landfill, what kind of waste was actually buried there for how long, and if there's a leachate pond, all that kind of information would be extremely useful for whoever wants to perform phase 2 environmental site assessment. So going to the next page of your document, you'll see that phase 1 environmental site assessment actually involves has few components. These components are very typical. The first thing is a records review. We'll talk about that in more details. What do we mean by records review? Interviews from the owner or from other people. Site visit and inspection is another important step in your environmental site assessment. Then you will do a very quick evaluation of gathered information. So you gather the information, you evaluate the gathered information, make your conclusion, and finally you write a report. And of course, in the end, you submit the phase 1 environmental site assessment to owner or client of the phase 1 property. It's very important that you keep in mind that you are actually hired by the client and you're only reporting to the client, right? So that's a very important thing. You're not a police, you're not a judge, you're just trying to help your client to understand what's going on in their property. So we talked about the record review and interviews. Let's see what are the details that you should be looking for when you actually conduct environmental site assessments. The first thing that you would do is to do one initial interview with the client or the owner. Keep in mind that there is possibly a reason that the client has hired you, so most likely they already have some idea or information about their existing problems. So it's very important to talk to them first, have the initiation meeting, ask them what has been going on, what's the reason that you're actually doing this job. You might ask them to tell you that what are the known conditions of the site. For example, if there has been any spill of any contaminant, if there was any groundwater pollution, or if there was for how long they had the land, for what kind of activities has been going on. So basically the site history. So you want to, in the first meeting, get as much information as possible, because this is basically the cheapest way to get the information, right? You don't do any sampling, you don't have to even go to the site, you just have a meeting with the client and ask them questions. You even may ask them to give you any records that they have from the site, any pictures, any evidence, any report from the past, if they have done any other environmental site assessment in the past, if any other company has done any environmental site assessment in the past. It is very common to deal with that kind of situation, that they already have had other companies working on the site. So you want to ask all those questions from the client or the owner. The other thing that you would have to do, the second important thing, is to review public environmental records. We know that for when we deal with environmental issues, water pollution, air pollution, soil pollution, any type of pollution or any environmental problems, we are actually trying to meet some guidelines. There are some guidelines for all of these resources. For example, there could be federal guidelines for soil contamination, there could be provincial guidelines, and there are sometimes municipal guidelines. Most of the guidelines for soil contamination are provincial and federal environmental regulations. Sometimes they are like environmental acts that you have to go and review. The reason that you're doing this is to find out the contaminants that you're trying to observe, or the activity that you're trying to observe in the property. Is it regulated under Environmental Act? And if it is, what are the regulations? What are the limits? And if when you do the phase 2 environmental site assessment, you might have to take samples and see if you are actually exceeding the limits or not. Very early on, it's very important that I explain this, that even though deep down, most of us who are actually in this program, we might be very interested in the environment, we might really like to save the environment at any cost, it's very important to know that our job as a consultant, when we deal with the client and we want to solve a problem for the client, is to solve the problem. We're not trying to save the environment per se, we're trying to solve the problem. And by solving the problem, we mean that we want to meet the guidelines. So if there is a pollution that in our mind, in our belief, it's heavily damaging the environment, but there is no guideline for that, and there's no restriction on that type of contamination by federal or provincial laws or guidelines, we do not really have to do anything about it. We are here we are hired by a client to basically solve the problem of the client, to make sure that he's protected, to protect his interests. So here we are trying to solve the problem. We're not trying to necessarily save the environment at any cost, even though it might look a little bit not very nice to say we don't want to save the environment. However, this is the reality, and we have to make sure that we always have that in our mind, that we want to solve the problem, we want to meet the guidelines, and those guidelines may not be exactly where we want them to be. Another thing is the review of historical records of the property that we need to do. remember that one of the things that is very important when we deal with any property is sometimes the contamination that could exist in the property may not be as a result of the current client's activities. Sometimes, for example, the site might have had a previous client who had who was using the site for some sort of manufacturing or agriculture. They may actually have some storage tanks somewhere that was removed but was never reported. So looking at the chain of titles, it's very important to find out who owned the property and what kind of activities was actually going on in the property. Sometimes looking at other records, for example, fire insurance maps could be very helpful. Any underground storage tank or even upperground storage tanks might appear on the fire storage maps. So if they do not appear right now, you might actually find a clue that there was a storage tank that was removed in the past. So you could actually go find, search for more evidences. Sometimes even looking at topographical maps or aerial photographs could help you to understand how the site was changed in the past few years, if there was any excavation happening in the site, any new soil was brought into the site, or for example, this is extremely important for landfills because landfills extremely change the topography and even the shape of the site. So you want to, if you have pictures from the past, it will tell you how the site has actually changed in the past few years. Another thing that you want to do in your phase 1 environmental site assessment is doing a site visit. And by site visit here, we just simply mean site visit. It means that you're not taking samples, you're not spending that much time or money on the site. You basically do some sort of walkover, you visually observe what is going on the site, what you see on the site. You might actually even take some pictures, record it for your own records, or to include in your final report. You might actually even ask questions around what kind of usage what kind of property usage was there for the current, what was the current or historical property usage. By looking at the site and by looking for clues and evidences of those kind of activities, you might actually find evidences that what was going on in the site in the past. So site visit, we just simply mean going and do the site visit and find out any evidences, maybe any photographs from the past you could find on site that could help you to understand what has been done on the property. Another process that you could do in your phase 1 environmental site assessment is conducting interviews. This is a little bit different from what we've done in the first step, which is the initial interview and the initiation meeting. Here, you want to go and ask more specific questions. Now that you have done site visit, now that you've done your public environmental record review, you've done your historical record review, now you have a little bit more information about the geographical area, you have more information about the requirements, the environmental requirements. You also have more information about the possible activities that could have been done on the property. So you actually go and ask the current client now more specific questions about that could give you more information about the site and potential contaminants. If you're lucky and you can have access to the previous owners of the property, it is always very useful to go and interview with previous owners. This is a very difficult step, of course, because the most previous owners may not want to deal with the property that they've already sold. So that's why it is not very likely to happen. However, if you are dealing with a bigger project and if you have time and if you have access to those previous owners, it's always good to go and ask more questions about the previous activities. Specifically, if you have some clues or if you found some evidence that shows that the contamination might have happened as a result of the previous activities, you may want to go and find those people who actually owned and operated the property in the past. Remember, environmental pollution, specifically groundwater pollution and soil pollution, could result in lawsuits, and sometimes the pollution might have happened as a result of activities in the past, so the current client may not even be liable for the pollution. So the previous clients might be liable, so it's always very important to get as much information as possible about previous activities that could even be used for selling this lawsuits in the future. Another step that you want to take is site evaluation. And here again, keep in mind that here we still are doing environmental site assessment phase 1. In phase 1 we are not taking samples, and we are trying to use limited resources to get as much information as possible about the site. So we basically look at the topography of the site. Maybe if there is a topography map available, we could look at that, see how that changed in the past. Also, this topography could help us to perform a phase 2 environmental site assessment in the future. Not only that, it will also help us to design and plan the soil remediation if the contamination exists. Geography and hydrogeology of the area is also important. By geography and hydrogeology, we simply mean like what type of soil we have, where is the bedrock, where is the groundwater table. Those are also very important pieces of information. You may even ask the property owner that gives you that kind of information. You may even walk around the property and get some sort of idea about what type of soil you're dealing with, and all these information will help you to very much in the next steps, or even could help you to write a better report about your phase 1 environmental site assessment. So again, we are not taking samples. We are basically just visually looking at the site. We are trying to find clues. We are trying to review the records. We are trying to interview people, even talk to the neighbors, walk around the property, look for any type of evidence that can show us what type of soil we're dealing with, where is the bedrock, where is the groundwater table, if the groundwater table is polluted or not. So we are looking at basically evaluating the site physically and visually. Another thing is the hydrology. By hydrology we mean where the drainage is, where are the slopes, when the rainfall happens, if there's any potential for the flood to happen in the area. It is also important. It will give us more information about how the drainage is happening in the area, because we know that most of the pollution will move with the flow of water. So it's very important to know that kind of information. So basically, we want to physically assess the area, and we want to physically see how the area is shaped. After you've done all of these different steps in your phase 1 environmental site assessment, of course, a very important part and process in your phase 1 environmental site assessment is to write a report. And by writing reports, we actually will see in our next video, you'll see that how we write a report. The writing report has some specific requirements, and typically you will follow some specific format for writing a report. So this concludes our phase 1 environmental site assessment. Again, as a summary, I want to explain that whenever you are dealing with any environmental, any soil contamination, as consultant, you take a few initial steps in order to find out if the soil is polluted or not. The first step is conducting phase 1 environmental site assessment, and in your phase 1 environmental site assessment you're trying to find as much information as possible without taking samples and without spending too much time or money, by just simply interviewing people, by doing site visits, and by looking at visual evidences in order to determine if the land is likely contaminated, and also if phase 2 site assessment is needed, and also to make a good base and find as much information as possible for your future steps, which is phase 2 environmental site assessment. Okay, thank you very much. Follow up on the next video to find out what should we include in our report for phase 1 environmental site assessment.